Yes, hello. So I, I'm just going to jump straight into my first slide. Who am I? I am Neil. Some of you might know me. I used to host Lundroid. I've been an Android developer for nearly 10 years now. Sometimes I'm a Scrum Master, which is why I like giving high-level talks and helping teams out. I've spoken at other conferences, but I'm actually very excited that this is the first time I've spoken at DroidCon London, even though I've been here for like the last 8 or 9 years or something. And I'm someone with a lot of hobbies. And I'm going to come back to this point later, but that's part of the inspiration for my talk. And yes, I pose with dogs, because that's what good people do. So, as all good talks do, they start with telling you why you're not here. So I'm not going to be here to tell you how to learn Jetpack Compose step by step. I'm not going to go through every little detail of the best way to do that. I'm not going to tell you how to learn Kotlin multi-platform. And I'm not going to tell you how to be an expert, but the reason I put an asterisk there is because I am going to tell you how to start your journey on being an expert. The idea is just kind of getting that little bit of exposure. So the point of today is it's a strategy to keep on top of things. I think a lot of us can be easily overwhelmed by everything that goes on here. We have a lot of stuff going on. Like, you learn about a million new things in the space of not even 48 hours. And to be able to consume all of this information and hear it from people who are super smart, and I'm quite happy to stand up and say here that most of those people are smarter than I am. They know things so well, and they're so passionate about it. And it can be off-putting. So I want to deal with this FOMO. It's something that I had really badly a year ago. So I thought I was just getting bad at my job. That's the easiest way to put it. So, you come to DroidCon, you hear about everyone starting to adopt Compose, you hear about all of the great things and details people are doing with Kotlin, and now like Flutter, all of this other stuff going on. I'm on a legacy project, and I have been for the last year and a half, 2 years. I spend a lot of my time fixing RX Java bugs. I spent an entire week on some horrific little threading bug that ended up being doing with like thread buffer issues, and it's incredibly frustrating. And you come here, and no one's talking about RX Java anymore. It's still relevant to a lot of people. It will be relevant for a long time for things, but it's kind of where do you draw this balance? What are we trying to achieve by learning but still having these older skills? So that's kind of where the inspiration came from. So before we get started, I want to just, quick show of hands. How many people are or have worked on a legacy project for an extended amount of time? Good, we've got the right people here. That's what I want to know. And secondly, who here has experienced FOMO because of it? So who here has been worried? Great. If you didn't put your hand up, hopefully you can use this advice to help other people. But yeah, so we've got the right audience. Fantastic. But why now? Why did I decide this year that it's a good time to do it? Like, I could have given this talk years ago. I could have just not given it and waited longer. But I think it's kind of the right time in the Android world to start talking about some of these things. A lot has changed. So I've been through a lot of these changes. I know that there's people who have been in the Android world longer than I have that have been through even more. But we moved from Java to Kotlin. I don't know if we remember that. That was a big thing. If I remember, it was 2017 that Google first announced that Kotlin was a first-class language, and then in 2018 it became the one to use instead of Java. So that was only 5 years ago, and I'm sure some of us still use Java on some old projects, and we don't like to touch that anymore. But that was a big change. And now we've got another big change happening, XML layouts to Compose. This is another massive kind of transition, and it takes time. It takes time for people to adopt and learn these things, but it's also a big source of FOMO, because we know that we have to learn that stuff. We know in 3-4 years' time, no one's going to care about XML layouts, and it's going to be treated as like old legacy stuff. So we've got some sort of time pressure, and I just kind of want to address, what is the right way to do this while maintaining some sort of balance? More stuff up here. We've got Flutter, we've got cross-platform now. Let's ignore React Native because no one wants to do that. But Kotlin multi-platform. I was speaking to someone early, and like one of the main libraries, like version 1 is meant to come out soon from JetBrains. So that's going to be another big thing that we need to potentially use. RX Java to coroutines and flows. That was it's a personal vendetta of mine. But yeah, and then little Android here. Android is now 15 years old, right? So that's kind of why I wanted to bring this up. It's been a long journey. A lot has changed. There's been these big, major transitions. And then going back to that point about my hobbies, we are all really busy. I don't know about you guys, but I do a lot of stuff outside of work. And I am not the type of person that is going to sit and spend weekend after weekend building major side projects and learning all of this new stuff. I would love to be that person, and I love the people that are. But I also have like a lot of things going on in my personal life. And with Android being 15, I think a lot of us are kind of growing in our personal lives with other big responsibilities. You know, a lot of the people I knew 5, 6, 7 years ago, now they have full families. You know, they can't necessarily come to a meetup in the evening because they've got 2 or 3 kids to look after. And they're big personal obligations that are fantastic, but they're going to take away more time and make it even harder to kind of stay up in this fast-moving world. So this is kind of what I wanted to address. And you know, whether you have a family, whether you're just a busy person, what is kind of a minimal effective dose? What is the little things of when and what, and everything that you can do to kind of lay out a sensible way of keeping up to date without stressing yourself out, essentially. So we're going to form a strategy. It's going to be pretty simple. If you sit and hear and you go, Neil, this is really boring. This is really straightforward. Why are you telling me this? That's a good thing. Because it means that I'm not overcomplicating this. I'm not trying to make it out like you've got to have some amazing nuanced plan of I'm going to spend this and learn these things and all stuff. Like it doesn't have to be nuanced. It just has to be simple, and you just keep doing it through time, and that's what's going to help you stay relevant. So we've got a table, you know, simple. I broke it down this way. I think it's relatively sensible in terms of life, but I just kind of wanted to address it in two separate kind of tangents that I follow to learn things. So the first I call passive. Now, passive is the wrong term, but I couldn't think of a better term. So dividing it passive and active. So the way we engage with things can be cognitively intensive to a varying degree. So some tasks, interruption, you know, I think we all know this. If you're writing software and you've got your head down and someone interrupts you, the context switch can really damage your ability to not just be creative and get stuff done, but your focus and all kinds of things, and it's very disruptive. I view passive activities that are kind of low on that scale, where you can do them at shorter times, you can have a distraction and then go back to it and still gain some value from the task you're doing. So some examples would just be, you know, reading newsletters, reading blogs, reading books. There's now a lot of good YouTube and Twitch content. If you know some of the Italian community here, they have the live streaming on Twitch called Code with the Italians. They have a lot of content that they live stream, them coding, which is kind of fun and interesting, and then they upload it all to YouTube. You've got meetups, you've got conferences, right? So everyone here has taken a step already towards staying relevant just by being at a conference and listening to people speak. But these passive activities are varying degrees. So like you could be on your commute and you could read a blog post. You might not gain a huge amount of like detail and memory from when you read it because it was a distracting environment. But there is still good value in doing that. That exposure is very helpful. And one of the main reasons I think it is because it's JIT learning, right? Just in time. So you don't need to know something until just before you need to know it. Which means having this kind of awareness of things going on, having small bits of knowledge and information, can mean when the time comes that you need to learn something, you're already a little bit from ground zero. You have kind of, you might even have references like, oh, to learn that, I know that there was this really good blog post, because you've just passively absorbed it in your day-to-day routine. And a lot of people really undervalue that kind of learning. Because if it becomes natural and over the space of time you just have, you know, the occasional 10, 15 minutes where you're just absorbing a little bit of information, it means that it's easier and the barrier to entry is less when you really want to start diving into something. So I think having that as a general practice and like part of your ways of working and like learning is super valuable. And then, you know, if with age comes wisdom, then you'll be wiser when you leave it to the last minute, right? So why you're going to be more effective? You're going to know more if you leave to learn things to the point where just before you need them. So then it's a better use of your time. So that kind of covers passive activities. So here's a really simple example. Every week I read one blog post. I go to a meetup once a month, and every year I attend Joy-Con. Great. It's part of your staying relevant, and I think people underestimate a lot of these things. But now let's move on to the active learning, and I think this is the harder topic, and I think this is probably why people are going to be here more. So these aren't exhaustive lists, but I just want to highlight a few important ones. Portfolio work, which we will go into detail shortly. Speaking at a conference. Hey, I'm here now, cool. Writing blog posts, that's not necessarily as straightforward as it might come across. It's not just writing. A lot of our blog posts have associated code bases. You're going to get feedback from people that requires maintenance. It's a lot more of a commitment than it might first appear, and it's a very deep kind of learning activity. And this bottom one, I think, is an interesting point that a lot of people maybe forget about, is you can just test stuff out on your day-to-day project. So if you're on a legacy project that you know through and through, you've been working on it for a while, it's a lot easier to adopt a new technology on a platform and a domain that you know well. So you can just pull a branch and spend a little bit of time doing some work to try something out, and the familiarity will make it much easier for you to kind of get into it, rather than starting some project from scratch. So I like to highlight that point. It's something I occasionally do just to see and compare to my day-to-day work. So we could have another really straightforward thing. Every month I'm going to do 3 hours of portfolio work, I'm going to write a blog post every 3 months, and I'm going to talk at a conference. Cool. I'm keeping these very high level. We will break it down further with actual specifics, so don't worry. But I want to talk about this portfolio work, because I think this is probably the most effective area to keep on top of knowing things, but also the hardest to kind of time and practice. The 3 hours time frame is arbitrary, but we'll, again, come back to it later. So how can we define it? Now, if anyone's done a technical interview, you're going to build an Android app. It's going to have a very simple, straightforward thing. It's going to demonstrate some really simple things. And so that's one area of your portfolio. I like thinking of work as a portfolio the same way like an artist would, because having kind of series of demonstrations is very useful. I call them interview apps because the simple apps you do for interviews are also a simple way of learning, and it's nice to kind of hit two targets with the same work. And then we have this exploration of if you want to try something out, get a little bit more involved. You're not trying to make something polished that you can show off to someone. So looking at these interview apps, there's a series, I will not go into detail. I think there's a lot of really good blog posts out there. There's people who I've potentially given talks on all of the details of how to make these apps. But essentially, they get broken down. It's a list of things. You click on, there's a detail view. It has text, probably has an image. You want to demonstrate some sort of architecture pattern, most likely a unidirectional data flow these days, some sort of MVI implementation. You need tests. You need sensible dependency management, Hilt, Coin, whatever it is. Good coding practices, because these are the things you're trying to demonstrate. And this is kind of the minimum. I threw image loading in there because I feel like that's very common. But doing this is kind of defining it as your portfolio of having a simple thing is going to be a really good way to always have something that you can keep up to date that's a minimal effective kind of piece. Oh. You can add more stuff. Yeah, you can kind of flesh it out over time. I really do not recommend adding more until you've got the core and you're happy with the core. So if you were going to do the must-haves, implement something, maybe you haven't really used Compose in an app recently and you wanted to learn the latest stuff, you build a really simple one, imagining that it's for a tech interview, covering of those things. And then over time, you'll be able to add extra stuff and kind of expand upon it, but it's just you've got this little core that allows you to kind of always have a hub for learning. And use Git. I shouldn't have to preach that at all, but I think it's, I'm going to highlight it anyway. You can track stuff with tools like Miro or Jira. You could track it with pen and paper or a whiteboard on your wall. I say this because this is long-term work. We're committing 3 hours a month to doing portfolio work. That's not very much time. If you don't have some sort of way of tracking the work you're doing, you're going to forget. It's as simple as, we all think we'll remember, but maybe you've got a busy month, you don't quite touch upon things. You go back a month or two later, what was I doing? That 3 hours isn't going to be as effective, so just having some sort of minimal tracking is useful. I like doing branching and PR strategies for my portfolio work, not necessarily for demonstrating to an interviewer or another company, but just for my own sanity. Looking at a PR template, for example, you can add a high-level description, link articles that you followed to learn, so then you have a track record of how you've been learning things, which it can be helpful. And tag your PRs. If you're learning Compose and you add a couple PRs there, just put Compose. I was learning Compose 2 months ago before I got distracted. What was I doing? Search those tags. Boom, great. Now I've got previous me helping me out by giving me a high-level description and links to the things that I was reading. A little bit of work helps through the long term. And secondly, like exploration work, I won't spend too much time on this, but I just kind of want to highlight a few things. It is really important to define what you're actually trying to do. So if you're trying to learn something and you don't have an end goal, it's very easy to get lost. So you might spend time with lots of nuances of your tests because that's the path you went down. But that was never the thing you were trying to learn in the first place. So it's kind of trying to keep yourself focused and understand what the actual end value is. Here's some examples. If you're going to share it, maybe you need to think about that. If you just want to see if you can get it working, you can throw coding practices out the window and just have fun and see what you come up with. Example being, if I'm going to build a Flutter app, maybe I want to mimic this interview app style. So I'm going to push that as kind of a really core way of keeping up to date because it's a very nice jumping block for learning other things. So if you spent time, you built a little list view app with detail views in some of the latest technologies, and then you want to learn something new, well, you have a sensible structure, things that you can reuse, and then you can just build the equivalent again in something else. So I did that with Flutter once. This is like a year ago or something. And it just means that you have something to compare, it helps you understand the technologies, but you already have part of the work done to learn something new. So again, it makes the barrier to entry lower. And then another example? Yeah. Say I wanted to learn about machine learning. Just scrappy code. It doesn't matter. I did this. I would never share the code. It's terrible, but it works. And it was just a way for me to experiment, seeing what happens if I wanted to do image identification with machine learning. I took my portfolio app, and I just jammed in camera code, meaning that I had all of my dependency management, all of my structure, Gradle builds, everything there. So I didn't have to do any of that setup to start a new project. And it just makes it a little easier. Treat it like a spike if you follow that practice. But that's all good. I can tell you the details of what you should do, but that's not actually the problem. Because if we all had plenty time, we would be building side projects and apps and trying all of these new tech out. But we just don't, right? Sometimes you just don't have that time in your life. So I kind of want to break down a few ways to structure how you can approach this. Blog posts take time, preparing talks take time. Portfolio work can really take time if it gets out of hand. So three areas I'll focus on first. This is kind of within your work, or close to your work time. So looking at deadlines versus downtime. So if you look at your project that you're working on, regardless if it's a legacy project or new, there will be peaks and troughs in terms of the intensity in which you're working. Maybe you've just started a project. You know that, it's going to be really busy. You're going to have lots of stuff going on. It's not realistic for you to starting a side project, spending a lot of time on your portfolio work. You know there's going to be certain releases. So you can kind of fill in the blanks over the space of a year and go, well, December's going to be easier. I'll be settled into this project, but there's no immediate pressure of deadlines. So I'm going to have 3 weeks where I really focus on, knuckling down on my portfolio work, spending those hours and really committing to it to, start building out and learning things. I cut off the last week in December, probably on holiday, probably not going to want to do that. Similar things are in January, March, avoiding times of release, not trying to focus on portfolio work a week or two before your first major release, things like that. So that's one way to kind of structure long-term, month by month. And then you can break that down into your kind of week by week or sprint schedule. So super simple example of meetings that happen in a sprint. For some reason, every time I work on a project, it always ends up to be these days specifically. I don't know why. But then, add in my personal commitments. These are generic. They're not specifically me. I'm not going to bore you all with my entire life schedule in PowerPoint. But, say this was a person, on the Wednesdays, this is Monday to Friday, by the way. I didn't load it. Wednesday, you have sprint planning, music lessons. You've got busy meetings on Thursdays and team socials and stuff. If I just kind of looked at that, I think, oh, well, these are the ideal days for me to learn stuff, right? I'm not busy on Tuesdays, Thursdays, Fridays, if those days are the sprint. But maybe that's not the most effective focus of your time, because on a Monday, I have less pressure from my manager. He is more likely to be busy in all of his meetings that he has, and it means that I'll be able to have a little bit of time at the end of the day to focus on something of my own, because I'll be really productive in the morning, where I can just focus on my actual work, and then I can be rewarded with having some time at the end of the day. Maybe a day where you've got lots of meetings, your flow for your general work is really heavily interrupted. So then it makes more sense to kind of focus on, a little bit of learning work for the hour that you've got that you can focus, rather than focusing on sprint work. And if you kind of structure some of your planning around, well, in the 2 weeks that I'm committing to deliver something, I'll be very effective on certain days in terms of my work, and then I'll be less effective on other days. And it's okay to kind of go, well, on those days, I'm going to be even less effective in terms of my work contribution, so I can focus a little bit on my learning. And if you have a good manager and good team, they will be very understanding of that. So talk to them. Talk to the people on your team and go, hey, I am not keeping up to date in the Android world. Lots of stuff is happening, and I'm on this old legacy project. I want to be able to stay. I want to be able to keep working on this, but I have this kind of FOMO that I need to address. Any good team or company and any good manager would be like, it's okay, we can carve out that time so you can spend 1-2 hours a week, at the end of your working day to do that learning. And I think if you go forward and actually speak to people, they will be more than happy. And plus, if you're a recruiter or a manager out there, keeping people up to date and happy is very good for retention. And I think that a lot of people will be like, if we can keep our mobile engineers happy and staying in the company, that's very cost effective and very useful. So it's in their incentive to give you time to learn. And then I could stand up here for an hour and give an entire lecture on behavioral stuff of going, how do you make yourself form these habits? How do you have a structure so that you're less likely to fail? But the kind of short summary is just make a small commitment. Go, okay, I'm going to spend a small amount of time once a week doing these things, and even if I just open up my Android Studio, I look at a little bit of code, maybe write a couple lines and close it because I'm not focused that day, that's still good enough because you're still forming that habit. So I think a lot of the pressure we put ourselves on this big level of going, hey, we need to learn all this stuff, oh my god, I don't know anything, that pressure can come all the way down to I'm not spending enough of my hours productive-wise, so then I'm a bad engineer, I'm a bad person. It's like, it doesn't matter. Sometimes just doing one line is enough to start forming that habit. And it's honestly a better way to look at it, right? It's just the small wins, the small commitment is good. But again, that kind of covers timing. I deliberately ignored weekends. That's up to you. You can spend your hours on a Sunday evening if you want, commit to 1 hour on a Sunday if that works better for your schedule. But I think it's better to try and address it in your Monday to Friday to give you the free time on your weekends and not try and steal away from that. But that's kind of a way of structuring, how you can address this stuff. But if you're committing a small amount of time, you still want to be effective. I realize I've got 15 minutes, so I want to make sure I'm going through this quickly. So let's take Jetpack Compose, the biggest elephant in the room of these things. First released in 2020, V1 in 2021. Latest release was last week, or just over 2 weeks ago. So how would I learn Jetpack Compose from the beginning? What would I do? What passive and active activities of learning would I do in my structure to address my need to know more about Jetpack Compose? Well, let's look at the timeline first, I don't know, is that font too small, maybe? Early days, there's lots of bugs. There's API instability. You're going to see a lot of the feedback going on, but stuff is going to change very quickly, and early adopters will address a lot of things. V1, you've got a little bit of stability. The API is probably not going to change a large amount. There's less bugs. learning resources are starting to grow, right? If you're trying to be time effective and you start from the very beginning, there's not going to be very many good articles to read. There's going to be a lot of what ifs, a lot of what could be. And they're interesting, and if you want to read them, that's amazing. But if you want to spend a very small amount of time learning something, it's okay to kind of keep that on the side burner. And then if we come on to the latest thing, it's pretty stable. Most of the bigger bugs are fixed. There's a lot of resources now. Like, how many talks this last 2 days have been on Jetpack Compose and learning really good things. So the content that you have is much richer. So if I was going to form a strategy to look at this, I would be like, well, at the beginning, just read some articles and blog posts. I committed to reading 1 article a week on a Monday morning. I'll throw in some Jetpack Compose stuff when I first heard about it. Maybe read an article, not paying super large amount of attention, but just enough that it's on my radar. When V1 happens, now we've all committed to doing a few hours a month of portfolio work. So this is the time where we can start to integrate this. You've got V1, it's kind of growing, the momentum's building, the resources are a little better, so it's easier and the barrier to entry is lower. Now's a good time to start thinking, okay, I'm going to integrate it into my small amount of work a week. And beyond that, it's up to you. I think at this point, all of us will be doing a lot more, but you can modify the stuff you've built. You can build something new. You can try out the different technologies and kind of expand upon it. But obviously, some people will be like, I'm ignoring it until V1, essentially. I'm aware of it, but it's like, well, the level of usefulness of my time is less when it's earlier on. So if I'm trying to be very, I'm a very busy person, etc., then that's probably a sensible approach. And Compose, actually, quickly go back. So Compose is a necessity, right? The same way that Kotlin was a necessity. We all know that we need to learn it. It will be the norm. So the strategy of awareness versus effective time is important. Now, if we move on to something like Flutter, you could argue that you have to know Flutter at some point, but you could argue that you don't. I think it's worthwhile learning, but then we can start to look at the trajectories again. So you've got this crossover when React Native was the biggest platform, and then Flutter kind of took over. This is from Stack Overflow of people talking about the different technologies. And we've got all the release dates there. I won't bother going into details, but do you even need to know them? Huh? Well, are you going to work on a cross-platform app? You don't know. If you're interested in companies that adopt that type of stuff, then maybe it's going to be higher on your priority list. If you're not, and you're looking at a lot of product companies, or you work in one where they're very focused on native apps in long term, it's okay to just not look at these things for a while. Like I have a little bit because I was potentially going to be building a Flutter app, but apart from that, I kind of left it low on my radar because it wasn't a priority for me. And then answering that question is important. So I think as you go on in your career, do you need to do cross-platform? Which is the best technology to use for projects? As long as you can answer that, I think your level of understanding is good. So super quickly, because I didn't time my talk very well, and I think that we're going to have to go a little faster. So yeah, cross-platform. Just keep reading stuff. Keep being aware of it. Be happy about knowing things, but not necessarily spending this really intense active learning on doing things. But if you think that it's going to be useful, maybe start building a test app. V1's out, stuff is going on. Like somewhere in this timeline, if you feel like it's going to become more important to you, start to integrate it into your portfolio work. Start to prioritize it a little more. So back to where we were. We have really simple strategy. Really kind of dumb, to be honest, right? It's just a table with things to do. Let's make it a little more detailed. So, instead of just a blog, I'm going to specifically read 2 articles from Android Weekly. Android Weekly is an email that you get that links probably anywhere between 10 and 15 articles and some interesting repos and links to talks and stuff like that. I get that every week. It appears in my inbox on a Sunday evening or something. So then I read 1 or 2 things on a Monday morning. Keeps me aware of stuff that's going on in the Android-verse. Really easy to do just over my morning coffee. I attend Lundroid, so I used to host Lundroid, and I'm involved with it in some way, but I like to go to that. It's a good way to kind of get more detail. I'm watching a talk that's 40 minutes long on a specific subject. I get a little bit more in-depth learning, but I'm still just kind of there participating. Coding live streams, I'm going to do that as well. For me, the important thing is the interview-style app with the list and detail view to learn technologies. That's what I'm going to focus my portfolio work on. I'll write a blog post to break down this talk at some point in a quarter. It's the idea. And then looking at a sprint really quickly, for me, Thursdays are normally my busiest days when it comes to work. Thank you for going back to hybrid working. I'm normally in the office on a Thursday, which means it's very distracting and there's lots and lots of meetings and it's like lots of the time for that. So for me, these are the times where I want to do the work. Portfolio work's on Wednesday, Monday. Blog posts are read on a Monday. Coding live streams, I just watch at my desk while I'm doing Jira admin for ticket stuff, because I normally end up doing that during the sprint. It's a task that I can do and kind of keep watching something in the background and kind of just have the knowledge going into my head in some way or another. 3 hours a month on portfolio work, but I'm doing it 3 times a week. That doesn't add up, right? I know that sometimes I'm just not very good at committing to these things. So I give myself the flexibility to go, you know what? I might just end up doing something on a Monday and going, well, I'm not going to do my portfolio work today because I can do it on that Wednesday. So give yourself flexibility in your schedule to kind of hit those minimum targets, and it'll end up being a little easier. So, yeah. So yeah, that is kind of the plan. Now, this is where it gets interesting, right? If you look at all of those stats, if I did everything I say I'm going to do, I'll read 104 blog posts in a year, do 36 hours of portfolio work, 12 live streams, 12 meetups, attend a conference, talk at a conference. That sounds like someone who's staying relevant to me. Well, and that was super easy to do. But that's not really realistic. There's 52 weeks in a year. I'm not going to do that every week. So, if I don't do any of that for 25% of the year, still 78 blog posts, 27 hours portfolio work, 8 live streams, etc., etc. That's still pretty good. But, that's a bit too optimistic, right? 50% of the year. So for 26 weeks of the year, I'm not doing a single thing. I still will achieve that amount of stuff. I think that's pretty good. 18 hours of portfolio work. If you ever get a technical interview test, they normally recommend 5 to 6 hours, which I don't think is true. You'll definitely spend more time on it. But that's more than enough to build a little app every year that allows you to demonstrate simple things like testing, architecture, adopting something like Compose, all the UI components, all of those things that are matter and part of our learning. 18 hours of work is definitely enough to do that. So I think that kind of adds up, and I think people forget how those little amounts of work over the year will lead to surprisingly good amounts of quality learning, essentially. And if you're not going to change job every year, so you've got another year of portfolio work that you can be focused on other learnings as well. For me, I think that's my goal to achieve. Trying to hit 75% of the year of things. But yeah, that's essentially it. Real takeaways are, don't make it more complicated. Just follow a simple structure. Plan slightly long term, plan in your sprints, plan in your personal life, make them both relevant, and look at your year rather than just your kind of week to week, because things add up when you do those little chunks of work. So you don't need to spend a huge amount of time to kind of keep on top of things. And that's it. I think I am just on time. Thank you. Do we have any questions? I'm also happy to talk in more detail with anyone who wants to talk maybe specifically about their current situation, if they just want someone to rant at for a few minutes. But if not, thank you very much for everyone being here. No questions? No? Cool.